The Pope is usually known for preaching peace, but that message has him embroiled now in a war of words with the U.S. president. Pope Leo has emerged as a vocal critic of the U.S. and Israeli military strikes on Iran, putting him at odds with Donald Trump. Just days after being insulted by Trump, the Pope is still speaking out, telling the faithful on his tour of Africa that the world is being ravaged by a handful of tyrants.
Masters of war pretend not to know that it takes only a moment to destroy. Yet often, a lifetime is often not enough to rebuild. They turn a blind eye to the fact that billions of dollars are spent on killing, on devastation, yet the resources needed for healing, education, and restoration are nowhere to be found. Jesus told us, "Blessed are the peacemakers." But woe to those who manipulate religion in the very name of God for their own military, economic, or political gain, dragging that which is sacred into darkness and filth.
Last year, Leo became the first U.S.-born pope. He avoided direct criticism of President Trump's policies until the U.S. president decided to strike Iran back in March. Now, Trump has hit back in his typical style with posts on social media lashing out at the Pope, but he was more diplomatic when asked about the spat on Thursday.
I have no disagreement with the fact the Pope can say what he wants, and I want him to say what he wants, but I can disagree. I think that Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. If they do, the whole world would be at jeopardy. The Middle East will be blown up and the whole world will be at jeopardy.
Well, to dig deeper into this, I'm joined now by Professor Linda Woodhead. She's from the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at King's College, London. She has written extensively about politics, society, and religion. Professor, it's good to have you with us. Pope Leo, he has shown that he's willing to take on Donald Trump and the president's administration over the Iran war. What do you think is driving his criticisms based on what he said?
I think he's driven by quite traditional Catholic social teaching, Catholic theology, and in a bigger picture, I think he's driven by concern about the rise of Christian ethno-nationalism, nationalism with quite a racist tinge that is such a powerful part of Donald Trump's support.
How unusual is it for a pope to be so direct in his criticism of a world leader, even naming Trump by name?
Well, it's not unusual. If you go back to the start of the papacy, there were constant skirmishes between popes and emperors. There were indeed wars between them and displacements, and popes carried off from the Vatican City. So this is absolutely nothing new. But if we fast forward to recent times, you'll remember that Francis was quite outspoken on some issues like immigration. And John Paul II, of course, played a very important role in criticizing communism and leading to the establishment of democracy in some of the formerly communist countries.
How do you think we should understand this? I said earlier in the week that this was a not so divine dispute. Is it a political disagreement, a theological disagreement, or something else?
Well, both of those, and I'm not sure you can really separate those things. I think the Pope's message is actually very politically attuned. He's making very direct political interventions almost in real time, but he's basing his comments on a very long tradition of Catholic thinking. He's appealing to the importance of law and morality, but also democracy in pushing back against what he sees as, he's actually called it tyranny, hasn't he? And the view that might is right. He's very clearly putting himself on the other side of that debate, that might is not right, that there are moral standards and laws that need to be upheld in the exercise of power.
The Pope and the U.S. president are two of the world's most powerful men. They're also both Americans. What does this clash tell us how they respectively understand power and morality? Does the fact that they're both Americans, does it play a role here in the fact that the Pope, for example, is willing to spar with the president?
Well, I think it means that the Pope understands the US situation, the theological and political situation, because the MAGA movement, the far-right Christian movement, is very, very important to that. And of course, this Pope will have an absolutely direct understanding. He will know the long history of Christian ethno-nationalism in the US. He will be alarmed at its current very powerful manifestation in Donald Trump's government and some of its figures who are very central to that tradition. And that tradition sets itself up. It says there's a thing called cultural Christianity. There's a Christian civilization. And the West is under great threat, particularly from Islam, as well as from wokeism. And Christians have to fight against that, literally fight. You know, there's often a lot of apocalyptic thinking that there is a real battle here for civilization. Now, that version of Christianity is very much opposed to traditional Catholic teaching and thinking, which is much more sophisticated about its understanding of Christianity and its many different forms of authority and its internal debates. And so the Pope can represent that version of richer theology, if you like, against a Christian nationalist tradition with a long history in America that he understands very well.
Yeah. I want us now to take a listen to what the U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, what he had to say. He was reacting to the Pope's criticism of the Iran war. Take a listen.
I like that the Pope is an advocate for peace. I think that's certainly one of his roles. On the other hand, how can you say that God is never on the side of those who wield the sword? Was God on the side of the Americans who liberated France from the Nazis? I think one of the issues here is that if you're going to opine on matters of theology, you've got to be careful. You've got to make sure it's anchored in the truth.
The vice president, he is, of course, one of the most prominent Catholics in the Trump administration, a rather new Catholic. We also have to add that. What do you make of him lecturing the Pope on theology?
Well, if I was the Pope, not very likely, I would think, you know, what a cheek. There is no doubt that the Pope will have a much richer, deeper education and grounding in theology than a recent convert, J.D. Vance. And Vance's criticism is just, I think even Vance must know that his criticism over war is just a false one. Christianity has a presumption for peace. That's what the Pope said. It does not say that violence is never justified. That's not what the Pope said. The Catholic Church has a well over 1,000-year-long history of thinking about what constitutes a just war. A just war has to have a just cause, and there have to be just means in the pursuit of that war. That's a very thought-through position. The Pope will know it very clearly. That's what he's appealing to. And J.D. Vance is evading that clear challenge.
Professor, what you're saying, though, what you're describing is what a lot of people would say is common sense. And yet we don't see a big uproar in the United States. Why do you think there hasn't been more pushback from the public, from Christians, to what the vice president and the president, for that matter, have said this week?
Well, because Christianity in the States has been changing very, very fast in the last few decades. You know, the United States is actually becoming much more secular, much more like the rest of Europe. And Christianity, whereas it used to be very mainstream, very varied, have a very large liberal centre, that has shifted. So Christianity has become more nationalistic and right-wing, and many young people have therefore left the churches altogether, and the liberal centre of Christianity in the States has really collapsed. Not completely, but it doesn't have quite the same voice. I mean, you did hear it speaking. Do you remember when Trump was inaugurated this time? There was an Episcopalian bishop who preached to him in a way he did not like about the importance of care for the weak and the poor. So it's still there, but it's much weakened. It's much weaker than it would have been, say, 40, 50 years ago, that mainstream tradition to push back at this capture of the Christian message by a far right.
I'm just asking, before we run out of time, the Trump administration frequently invokes religion and the name of God when it defends its policies and its actions. The Pope says that is dragging that which is sacred into darkness and filth. Do other religious leaders, do they agree or do they see that differently?
Other religious, I mean, it is true that the churches, anyway, in Europe have had they've really found it quite difficult to push back against this grasping of power on the far right. They have struggled to really strongly repudiate it. But it is happening. You do see it. The Church of Norway, do you remember Anders Breivik was a Christian terrorist who murdered many people in Norway? The Church of Norway, partly because of that, was forced to absolutely straightforwardly repudiate this version of right-wing Christianity, to think very hard about it, to confront past Christian anti-Muslim and anti-Jewish sentiment and violence, and to work much more closely with Muslims to argue against this idea that we have to reestablish a Christian civilization that is anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, against the weak, and all about the exercise of power and God being on the side of the powerful. And it's very interesting now to see, that's a Protestant church, it's interesting to see the Catholic Church now backing that up and making some similar moves.
Yeah, it is interesting to see the struggle about when do you stand on an eye for an eye and when do you stand with turning the other cheek. Fascinating discussion. Professor Linda Woodhead from King's College London. Professor, we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us and putting all of this into an educated context. We appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you.